Hello, and welcome to our latest product webinar. These sessions are designed to give you an update on what's new at RecordPoint with some deep dives into specific topics. It also gives you an opportunity for some Q&A with the team. So if you do have any questions as we go along, please pop them in the chat. So today we'll be exploring our new intelligent signaling features, which we're super excited to have just released. We'll be looking at how these new features can help inform your own data privacy strategies and how to be more proactive with data privacy. We're also going to be covering off some privacy legislation developments around the globe. And then we'll be showcasing the intelligent signaling features that allows for that scalable identification of personally identifiable information, so that PII, and payment card numbers, so that PCI, as well as low value ROT data, so that redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. So quick introduction before we kick off. Both Chris and I are part of the product team here at RecordPoint. I'm Belinda Walsh, heading up product marketing and responsible for ensuring that our customers are kept up to date on our platform and new features. We also have Chris Brown, our VP of product, along today to take you through the intelligent signaling features in more detail and the privacy outcomes that they can help you achieve. So data breaches where personal information is being compromised is becoming more and more regular. In the US, more recently, there have been high-profile data breaches with the likes of Twitter, AT&T. In Australia, where I'm based, we've had some high-profile breaches with a large telecommunications company, Optus, and a private health insurance company. And in the case of Optus, there was over 2 million customers and past customers who had PII compromised. So things like driver's license, passport details. So some of the most sensitive data that an organization can collect. But what are the true costs of these breaches? I think it goes without saying that the financial costs can be astronomical. So we were recently at a privacy conference and an example came up of what's the cost of stamps, for example, for a mail out to all customers following a data breach. So it may seem silly, but we need to be honest about all the resources that are allocated to dealing with privacy issues, especially dealing with them in a more reactive fashion. So then there's the cost of losing trust with your customers. A recent study suggested that 75% of customers won't use services or purchase products from organizations they don't trust with their data. And close to 50% permanently stop using an organization's services following a data breach. So if your organization has a breach, you want to be in control of the narrative and minimize that reputational damage. So knowing exactly what personal information you have and where is the starting point. So today's customers have an expectation that the data they share with you will be protected and it will be correctly managed. So this goes hand in hand with the legislation which is being increasingly enforced across the globe. In the US, there's not yet a singular law that covers the privacy of all types of data. Instead, it has a mix of laws such as HIPAA, so the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, FERPA, so the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, for example. But many states have, in a sense, taken matters into their own hands and are in the process or have already passed state data protection laws. And there have been 39 states considering comprehensive privacy laws since 2018. So the International Association of Privacy Professionals has some great resources like their legislation tracker. So that actively tracks the proposed and enacted privacy bills across the states. And we can include that in the follow-up we send to attendees after the webinar. So how can you make good data privacy decisions if you've not classified or understood the data you're responsible for governing? So considering data privacy in the context of an overall records lifecycle and as part of a broader information management program is key. So data privacy should be informed by record keeping, by data inventory, by data classification, and it should be aided by data minimization. So if you're working together, so information managers, privacy officers, and IT security teams, you can be armed with the information necessary to create processes and protect that information instead of simply just storing it. So although terms used across the different legislation and privacy standards have some differences, there's a lot of overlap and they all cover common ground. So we've put together a helpful guide on all these terms and the definitions across jurisdictions, and we're going to make that available to webinar attendees. So if we start with personal data, that's a term defined by the GDPR. So personal data is broad in scope and means any information that is clearly about a particular person. So the term's personal information, very similar to personal data, and is used in various pieces of legislation, including CCPA, for example. So generally speaking, personally identifiable information, so that PII, is information that can be used on its own or combined with other information to identify or locate a single person or to identify an individual in context. And there's PII definitions in privacy standards such as NIST. So lastly, sensitive information, which is a subset of personal information. So sensitive information examples include racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, sexual preferences, and genetic data. So if we just touch on some of the typical PII identifiers often collected by organisations. So you've got name, passport details, you've got various identification numbers throughout different jurisdictions. So in the US, you've got US Social Security number. In other jurisdictions like the UK, you've got NHS numbers, date of birth, payment card industry data, private health information, and biometric identifiers also. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris, who will take us through how we scan for many of these pieces of PII as part of our new intelligent signalling features. And he'll take you through a few use cases. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Belinda. Intelligent Signals automatically detects private information at risk and across the entirety of your data inventory. What we're able to do now is, utilising the power of the Records 365 platform, is actually capture not only the documents and records from all of those sources, but on their way through our new intelligence pipeline, start to put additional information, additional signals or metadata on every single object, including whether or not it's got things like personally identifiable information, credit card information, and a number of other signals. I want to talk to you very, very quickly about the how this happens. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, obviously this is a little bit of a refresher on how Records 365 works. But for those of you who are very familiar with the architecture of Records 365, it's the key elements here are in that intelligence engine. So our users, be it finance users, HR users, your standard administrative users, people working with the data sources that you have today, SharePoint, file shares, Box, SAP, Salesforce, Teams, OneDrive, Exchange, all of these different sources and obviously thousands of others automatically connected to with the Records 365 connector framework for managing that information. However, these users, they don't know any better. They're just working their way through their day, working with the solutions that they have. In a perfect world, these users obviously know and understand that records management is one of the important outcomes to their organisation. And I'm sure most modern organisations are now starting to train them around their privacy requirements as well. Legislation across the planet now means that you just shouldn't be capturing personally identifiable information or credit card information and storing it somewhere without the appropriate level of security. Data security teams are obviously starting to deal with all of these breaches across the globe and starting to think about, how do we manage that information better? Now, there's actually a role to play for information management here. If we're already looking at all of the information across these sources, capturing it and dragging it through that platform, one of the interesting things we're now able to do is not only are we able to make sure that as it passes through that intelligence pipeline, we're getting all of the appropriate rules and classification through our AI and ML XML tool, assigning it the appropriate classification from the file plan. We can actually reach out, and in previous webinars, we've spoken about our metadata enrichment tool, able to go out and reach into third-party systems to provide additional metadata to help make those classification choices. We're also now, as it comes through that same pipeline, able to identify PII, PCI, and ROT signaling, redundant, obsolete, and trivial information signaling as well, meaning that by the time that data is managed inside Records 365, your information managers are going to be able to start to report and provide not only information on that information as it relates to records management purposes, but now supply reporting to the rest of the business as to the types of signaling and the PII and other signaling that's on that information. That signaling can be reused for multiple purposes. From a data security perspective, imagine as a cybersecurity expert knowing exactly where in your organization PII information lives, knowing how to migrate that around, how to move that around before it happens, making sure that you're actually securing those environments that regularly capture PII with additional factors like multi-factor authentication, additional firewalling, or even other sorts of encryption at rest. These sorts of reporting and tooling helps organizations to identify that, not only from that perspective, but then also the records management perspective, making sure organizations, if they have the policy of we don't keep credit card information for any length of time, that when it actually shows up inside the system, that they're able to destroy that almost immediately, ensuring that they still have a record of capturing that information, managing it appropriately, and obviously working their way through that process of providing a disposition certificate so that they can always prove that they had it and disposed of it according to a series of rules and regulations. That helps in this instance for all data across the entirety of your organization passing through that same intelligence pipeline, getting that additional information around obviously the metadata enrichment services, our PII, ROT, and PCI signaling services now as well. So I want to talk you through a couple of examples or use cases for the intelligent signal services. I spoke a little bit here about that a need for your data security organization to start to understand better where the data lives in your organization. There are some places that it's very obvious. For example, in the financial services systems, you'd have to imagine that there's credit card details, payment details, all sorts of invoicing and other address details. But it's not necessarily so obvious in unstructured data sources like SharePoint and file shares where that information lives. And like most organizations, I would imagine your organization has a finite budget for data security. So being able to identify where that data lives, where that important or highly sensitive data lives in your organization would mean that they'd be able to spend that data security budget in a much more effective way. And so one of the ways we can do that is to help organizations expose that, what we call dark data. Do you have pockets of information around the organization where teams or projects are capturing credit card information or other personal information in different places without the knowledge of the wider security team, for example? Regulations that now are absolutely capable of fining organizations for not knowing about this. CCPA, CPRA have that whole do not sell environment. So again, ensuring that people are able to provide that sort of level of consent. You've got the Australian Privacy Act and all of its new fines that have been implemented. And obviously we'd be very, very familiar with the more global European GDPR standards. The most important thing here is that not knowing where you're keeping that PII or PCI information isn't an excuse that you can use to defend yourself against these regulations and compliances. And more importantly, that not knowing actually is a risk. And so when we get to this when a breach happens rather than if, your data security team is not armed with the best set of information. And so what I want to show you now is one way that you can help those organizations to start to report out and understand what information is across all of your data stores. So let's jump across to the software very quickly. I'm going to start here in SharePoint. I'm inside the Edge Communications project site. There's a bunch of documents there. And what I'm going to do is just drag a new document in. Let's imagine that I was working with a bunch of teammates and we've actually worked on this new document. You can see that document now upload, and there's that new proof of identity document. Now, you might question why there's a proof of identity document inside this communications project. Perhaps it was misfiled. Perhaps something like this particular team needed that particular information just for this project for a very short period of time. There might be lots of reasons why personally identifiable information could end up in a place like SharePoint. As I said, at the end of the day, all of the training in the world, all of the right policies in place, people can still capture this. And importantly, a lot of the regulations are not about not capturing personally identifiable information, but more about understanding what you have and ensuring that you're managing it correctly and keeping it for the right length of time. And in a lot of other cases like CCPR, making sure that you're not ongoing, CPRA, making sure that you're not selling that information where the customer hasn't previously consented to that and that sharing of information. So again, the main reason why I'm doing this is just to sort of showcase that ultimately at the end of the day, you could be sitting inside a normal unstructured environment and private data might end up in there. Now, the nice thing is that with Records 365 connected here, that object's obviously now being captured in the background of Records 365. And if I was to jump over to Records 365 now, you would actually see that document in the environment. So let's jump across Records 365. If I go across now very quickly to Browse, you'll actually see that new document there. So there's that proof of identity document. I could click in, see the details about that document. And what you're going to see is a whole new tab called Signals. And if we were to click in, you can actually see that it's already processed a number of different signals against this object. So you can actually see there that it has credit card information, that it's got a number of Australian record details like tax file number and business number. And it also happens to have a US driver's license in there as well. So again, this document has a bunch of highly sensitive information that's actually been captured inside an unstructured environment like SharePoint. Now, of course, as a records team or an information management team, it's highly unlikely you're going to walk through every single one of these individual documents. You will have millions, if not hundreds of millions of objects being managed. You're not going to go and see these individual documents. You're more likely going to want to go across and see this in some sort of report. So let's go there now. So here's some information that we're pulling out of that data warehouse. You can see here in the report, a bunch of information around the total number of items. So in this particular environment, there's over 500,000 items. Nearly 300,000 of those items have some form of PII. So that's a bit of a roll up of it might have emails and other things that are actually captured in there. More importantly, though, that less than 10%, but sort of, somewhere between 8 and 9% there is, there's 34,000 objects that have credit card details in them. That's actually really important and something that we want to understand. Well, why is that particular information being managed in that particular way? You can see where the types of documents are, what sort of documents are, the categories that are being applied on those. And so that's actually some really highly valuable, information sort of at a glance. If we jump across now to, say, another particular report, again, I've created a little bit of a report here that creates some sort of linkages. Again, those same items, you can start to see the different types of signals that have been captured inside this environment. You can see there that nearly 2,000 items have a US driver's license number. A number of them have passport details, some medical license information, even an IBAN or an international banking number, for example, is there. That US social security number has 124 items, and then the sort of the equivalent Australian tax file number has nearly 380 items. And if you look at this visual, it's going through all the different sources that are currently under management. So you can see I've got a SQL Server environment, Exchange Online, OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, and file shares. So lots of unstructured environments. And obviously I could have Salesforce and SAP and other environments as well. But in this case, lots of unstructured environments that still have lots of linkages to the different types of signals that I've been capturing through this item. So again, another visual way for organizations to see, well, we are keeping a lot of phone numbers and email addresses, for example, in our file shares. So perhaps this is something that the security team might want to deal with, making sure that those file shares are obviously better secured. Perhaps they're encrypted at rest, to ensure that there's no data exfiltration from those environments. We can even look at the individual details. So dragging through all of the different types of files, and obviously now this is a listing of everything in the environment, and sort of seeing the flags across them. Again, tax file numbers and security numbers, that credit card information. And you can obviously see lots of PII, in this case, lots of proof of identity files in this particular environment. So you're seeing lots of those scattered throughout the environment. Now, while that's useful in one way, when you start to look at the individual sources, you can start to do even more. So again, linking here, for example, we can start to see on the file shares the types of information, the locations of that information to those file shares. Some of those file shares are online file shares, others are sort of that traditional mounts. But you can see that same sort of information, and it might be appropriate for proof of identity information to have those different types of information, but there might be other areas where it won't. And then of course, the actions now are that not only can data security go away with this information and make better decisions around their security investments, but the information management team can start to work with the organization, say, should we be keeping these things in this particular place, because file shares might be less secure than, say, for example, a SharePoint or other environment. So let's talk now about another use case. So for example, those signals themselves can actually start to drive the records management outcomes. And those outcomes that I'm talking about are data categorization and data minimization. So by knowing the sensitivity of the information contained in every single object, records teams can obviously start to make really good decisions around the disposition or the retention schedules that are applied to these types of things. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that we could talk about how you may not want to have any credit card information stored at all in our managed services. So making sure that when that information does arrive, it'd actually instantly go straight through to a destruction or a disposal process so that you can actually approve and destroy that information. Again, proving that you had it, but because it had credit card information in it, that you actually destroyed it, within a very short period of time, helping you to meet all sorts of compliances and also build that trust with your end users, being able to showcase that that sort of information isn't going to be exposed for a breach because it's constantly a part of a process of disposition. So let's jump back to the software quickly. So again, if I was to jump into my advanced search, for example, I've got a PCI search here that I've saved previously, and you're going to see a number of results. Now, importantly, that document that you saw earlier, you saw it have the signals there for credit card information, the document I put in earlier. This document's currently uncategorized. It doesn't have any detail on it. It's waiting for categorization. If I was to go down, I might find this other document down here, for example, this tax benefits document. You can see that this one, for example, is currently on a finance general disposition class. And if we would click into the document, again, we'll see that signals tab, and we'll see that it has the signal for PCI. Now, for this particular document, we could obviously go through and reclassify. We could go back to that search and click a number of the objects and reclassify them. But ultimately, if we know that this type of information is something that we want to send to a different disposition, we can actually use that same signal as regular metadata for building and editing rules. So if I was to go into my file plan very quickly, you can actually see here that I've built a very simple PCI is true, file plan entry. You obviously wouldn't do that, but for the purposes of the demo, you can see that it's got a retention schedule of destroy immediately after the created date. So ultimately, within a day of this landing in the system, anything that's associated with this would be marked for ready for disposal, allowing us to ensure that we're able to easily meet our requirement of regularly disposing of information that had credit card information. So one of the ways we could do that was we could actually start to edit in our rules, for example. Now, again, I've got a very simple rule here at the top of the tree, which again, probably isn't particularly normal, but for the purposes of the demo, it'll help. But if I was to go PCI signals is equal to yes, I could actually set that then directly to that PCI is true. So again, anything coming through the rules would automatically hit these. If it had that signal, it would automatically get that classification. So if I went back to my search, we'll quickly publish that. Don't publish it, it's not going to work, Chris. We'll go back to my search. And so in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to resubmit that object so that we've made changes to the rules engine. You would hope that that would now roll back through and changes would be made. What we can also do is actually go and click on, say, a couple of these proof of identity documents. And one of the other things that we could do now that we know that these have PCI and this is in an area where we don't want to deal with this, we can actually reclassify them directly. If we, for example, didn't want to set up the rule, it was something we wanted to do more manually, we could click through and apply those as well. So if we were to now go and refresh that screen and hopefully the resubmit and other things have all happened, we click refresh. We can run that search again. And what you're going to see is that tax benefits document is now classified as PCI as true and well past its disposal date. And so are these other objects as well. They've all got that PCI as true classification and are due for disposal. So again, being able to utilize that same set of signals to provide actions that allow an organization to make good decisions about how they want to manage that information as they work their way through. So again, having really good data categorization allows you to ensure that you're minimizing the data that you're keeping based on those sensitivity labels and signals that are coming through the intelligence pipeline. One of the other ways that you can use the intelligence pipeline is to identify rot, or that redundant, obsolete, and trivial information, allowing you to sort of draw the line between high and low value information. One of the key things about most of the Public Records Acts across the globe is ensuring that you're managing all of the evidence of business transactions. That's that very simple definition of what a record is. And before automation, before we all used to have this capability of manage in place with a tool like Records 365, we only ever really captured the highest of value data. And what I meant by that is you would physically take your object, your file, or your printed out document and slide it into the folder. Very, very rarely would you reach across your desk and also grab other trivial information like the birthday card or the congratulations slip or other things that weren't related to that. That's a very simplified example of making sure that we only captured that high value data. As you moved into the electronic world, you were walking through, you'd be checking in and checking out that important information, finalizing and actively participating in the program of work around that high value data. Now, of course, that was also very inconsistent because it required the individual to make sure that they knew what high and low value was. And it wasn't necessarily that the finance team or the sales team or the asset team were highly skilled at that information management purposes. And so all sorts of rules and other things were sort of built in. And over time, we've led to this more automated world where we're able to capture and manage almost everything from all sources for you automatically, provide that disposition using AI and ML. Now, of course, using ROT signals, we can now start to determine what is really low value information quite easily and allow you to eliminate that from that information or records management corpus, ensuring that you're only hanging on to the things that you should be hanging on to, and then on the back of the appropriate AI and ML classification, and then keeping them only for the length of time you should be keeping them. So again, this high value to low value piece is really, really important. So let's jump across to the software and have a bit of a look at that now. If we jump across into our ROT report, as those objects were passing through the environment, you're able to see in here that there were 11 files of that 500,000 that met these ROT rules. And the ROT rules here were, was it an archival file, like a zip file that didn't have any particular value, or did it have a default file name like document.docx, or was it an empty file or a really, really small file? Was it a system file like a .exe or a .dll file, for example, or even just a temp file that was picked up somewhere inside a file share where there was working objects going on, but they weren't supposed to be managed, or even simple things like template files. Some organizations love to manage their template files, others don't want that overhead inside their records management corpus. Now, again, just because it gets these signals doesn't mean you have to destroy it, but of course it does give you the capability now to walk through your system and start to work out, well, what do I want to manage? What is marked with low value markers like these ROT signals, and what else can I do with it? So again, if we jump into Records 365, we can now start to do some other advanced searches. So let's jump into the advanced search area. Again, I've got a search here for system files, and you can see that a particular system file has met that requirement. If we were to click on the object and have a look at signals, you can see that this has been marked with a ROT signal of is a system file. It's a JSON file. In this instance, I don't really want to keep it. What I'm able to do is I can actually remove this all together from my environment by actively just using the nap delete functionality and deleting this object directly from the environment. If I was to do that search again, you can actually see that that system file is now gone. It's no longer available in the system. The other types of signals that you might be able to see here, for example, would be duplicates. So if we go and have a look at the documents that I put in earlier, these files, while they all have different names, are actually all exactly the same file. And if I was to click into duplicates, you'll actually see that each of these objects is also a duplicate, meaning that you can now start to walk through and work out whether or not, which is the most important one, whether you want to, keep these duplicates, or you can go back through that same process of either disposing or deleting them from your system as well. Again, removing that low value information, getting it out of the system, making sure that your records corpus and that information that's been under management is the information that you want to keep and then that you require for compliance purposes. So importantly, that gives you an opportunity there to work through one of the key features of Records 365 as it relates to data security, and that's data minimization. The data doesn't exist and is not under management. It's not actually stored in the system anymore, and it's been removed completely from your environment, that even in an event of a breach, that file is no longer available. So making sure that by doing good data categorization, getting data retention and getting to data disposition allows that data minimization element to remove the object, providing the most secure outcome of removing the risk of that object altogether. So again, just want to quickly remind you of that flow is that users just get on with their day-to-day, work in the systems that they need. As that information is connected through the connector framework to the intelligence pipeline, all of the other features of Records 365 are now enhanced by that PII, PCI and ROT signals being able to identify additional information, gives those records teams a whole bunch of extra information for use for categorization and data minimization, while also providing valuable reporting out to the rest of the business so they can identify and understand, should we have this type of data in these sources? And of course, those reports are all customizable. I would imagine working with your teams, you'd start to be able to think about all the different ways you could take that data and publish it out to your world and make sure that it adds high value to you and your customers. So again, I will have shown a bunch of different signals today. This is important to note that these are obviously just some examples of the different signals that are here. If you're in different regions, there are obviously other signals that are required for those regions that are available. And more importantly, as we move forward, you're going to be able to customize and create fully custom signals. So you might want to identify a customer number or a project status number, all sorts of other things that make sense to your organization, which would drive different outcomes. And those customizations are all going to be available. You can push and see that through in the software today. Obviously, a little bit of extra work that's involved, and you'll start to see some of those things as we talk about futures here in a moment. So what else are we going to be able to do with signals? What's the driver, not beyond just the things I've spoken about today, but certainly there's lots of privacy requirements as it relates to the data that you're managing today. And some of the other things that you're going to be looking at as you look at GDPR and CCPA and all of the other different privacy legislations globally is things like DSAR or data subject access requests. That ability to provide a report on the basis of a request for what do you have on me, your customer, your constituent. Ensuring that process actually allows to go right through all of your environments, pushing out that data and following that bouncing ball, helping you to process those requests really, really quickly, including doing things like redacting data that perhaps you need to let someone know that you've got on them, but you don't necessarily want to be shipping the entirety of those documents out, for example. And that's sort of a very similar process to what I would call FOIA or Freedom of Information Access as well, where you're actually requesting of a government agency, understanding what do they have about a particular topic, not just necessarily an individual, but obviously that same process of driving through, using signaling to pull information out and show that high value data as well as processing that information. And you'll see a lot more from us on this front as well. Now, I mentioned customization. So again, right now we can build a bunch of tools for our customers, work with your implementation teams to make sure you get the right signals, but we want to get to that place where it's just super easy to generate all of the different types of signaling that our customers want. So again, working on the platform to ensure that we're creating even more ease of use experience around that customization of signals. And then of course, all of those things that were those outcomes, creating policies that allow you to just define when we see this type of signal perform that action, or when we see this combination of signals start to build a new signal that helps us to identify the criticality of these signals together, for example. So we have some roll-ups like that now in the software where person and name and address obviously rolls up to things like PII, but you may have a different set of customizations that would actually roll up to something completely different to help you not only with privacy reporting, but also maybe information management, etc. as well. And with that, what I'm going to do now is hand back to Belinda. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks again, Belinda.
Thank you, Chris, for taking us through that. So just to recap, we've got the privacy signals as part of the intelligent signaling feature set. So that PII, that personally identifiable information, and that PCI, so that payment card industry data. And it's ongoing signal enrichment. So as content is modified, if PII is subsequently added to a piece of content, as it comes through the pipeline, that also gets identified. So then there's the ROT signals, so those redundant, obsolete, and trivial data identifiers that are also part of the intelligent signaling feature set. So intelligent signaling is available right now to be activated in your RecordPoint account. You would have received an email recently letting you know how you can get access to that and how you can get that activated. We'd really love to see customers getting that activated so they can start to see some signals coming through and then think about how that can help inform their own data privacy strategies. So if you want to scan the QR code there, that'll take you to a form. If customers complete that, we can get that activated in your RecordPoint account and we will let you know once that's activated. So we're going to hang around for a little bit longer for any questions that people might have. So if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat there and we'll stick around and try and answer those, or we'll get back to you after the webinar. So thank you everyone for attending our latest product webinar today. We hope to see you on future webinars in the not too distant future. And thanks again for attending.